What's up, all my soldiers? This is CGT Reacts today, and today I got another beautiful video for y'all. We diving into the realm of freedom, of understanding, of trusting the history that was naturally given to us by the universe instead of the word of man. And we're going to learn, we're going to grow, and gosh darn it, we're going to prevail. Today we're going to be reacting to Democracy Now! Democracy Now! They got a weird vibe going on nowadays. I can't really tell if they're corporate media or not, but I think Democracy Now! Is actually corporate media. I'm not sure. Even though they've had some really great they had some really great reports and news and interviews on there, I still think they're corporate. And that's only important so you can know how much control somebody has over something, a business in the field of something like news. How much control can they actually have over their news? This right here is a great video. I can't even slack it. I haven't watched it all. I haven't even watched it yet. But just the name of it is called, as you can see if you're watching it on YouTube, it's called Shackles and Ivy: The Secret History of How Slavery Helped Build America's Elite Colleges. Whoa. Now, we on this side over here. We reacted to this video right here on my side because I know that slavery happened. I know that slavery is still happening. And I know what slavery really is. It's employment. Slavery means employment. That's what that means. Employment, especially under somebody who's not related to you or married to you or in your family in any way, or somebody you'll never meet ever, actually. So with that being said, Shackles and Ivy. A lot of these Ivy League schools have what we call secret societies and stuff like that. And a lot of these Ivy League schools, we don't know nothing about their history. It's just the fact that if you get accepted into a college or if you get somehow, like, you get to speak at one of these colleges, or if you come out of one of these Ivy League schools, for some reason, your career and your status in this society and in a global European Eurocentric society, because you go to these Ivy League schools, Stanford, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, all these schools, you are automatically given an advantage in the society. And that's because of many different factors. But the main factor is you're keeping knowledge inside of a circle of aristocrats. You're keeping knowledge inside of a circle of oligarchy. You feel me? You're keeping knowledge inside of a circle of people who are not going to share the knowledge with everybody else. They're simply going to extort the knowledge and make it into a service so that everybody else can use it. That's what they do. Now, it's important to know that because this is going to help us dive into this video. We trying to figure out, once again, we on this path of understanding that slavery isn't what we thought it was. So this is going to help us get a tighter understanding of what slavery actually is and was. And on top of that, it's going to give us a very, very in-depth look at how these Ivy League schools work behind closed doors. I know you want to see this shit, so I'm going to stop talking. My bad.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we turn to a new book, 10 Years in the Making, that looks at how some of the country's major universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, Rutgers, Williams, the University of North Carolina, to name just a few, are drenched in sweat and sometimes the blood of Africans brought here as slaves.
Okay, we're going to stop already. Just say Africans brought here as slaves. Now, that narrative is played out. We already know that narrative played out. We already know, yes, some Africans did come over here from the Caribbean islands. We already know that a lot of Africans ended up over in South America. So with that being said, not 90% of the fucking people who you're calling African American are actually native to America. So with that being said, we already had this.
The book is called Ebony and Ivy: Race, Slavery, and the Troubled History of America's Universities. In it, MIT history professor Craig Stephen Wilder reveals how the slave economy and higher education grew up together. He writes, the American campus stood as a silent monument to slavery, Well, this history is silent no more. Professor Craig Stephen Wilder joins us here in New York. Welcome to Democracy Now!
Thank you very much.
So,
all right, so I'm just want to say this right quick too, because this is right here it's a pod. I don't know if it's gonna be a podcast or reaction. Either way, it's links up to each other. So the next video I'm gonna be reacting to after this is Cornell West, right? So pretty much it's interesting to me that these Ivy League schools have been around since fucking the 1800s. Some of them even before then, if you really think about it. Some of them actually came over here. Some of these Ivy League schools actually are extensions of schools that were started in Europe. When they was colonizing and shit, they just brought the knowledge over here in different, forms and shit. So I just thought about that. Y'all think about that. You telling me that these fucking Ivy League schools have been around since basically around the same time as the Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction, all that shit, where there was a lot of racist bigotry, hatred, war, and psychological warfare. You telling me that these schools were created around that time? You telling me that these schools were created around that time and nobody ever questioned this stuff? Nobody ever questioned, how did these schools get so powerful? How did these schools get so much money? How did these schools become such a great resource for knowledge? We're going to find out. Let's
talk about America's most elite universities. What relation do they have to slavery?
I think there are multiple relationships. The first and probably most poignant, most provocative, is the relationship to the slave trade itself. In the middle of the 18th century, from 1746 to 1769, fewer than 25 years, less than a quarter century, the number of colleges in the British colonies triples from 3 to 9. The original 3 were Harvard, Yale, and William and Mary, and all of a sudden there were 9 by 1769. And it triples in that 25-year period. That 25-year period actually coincides.
See, I was wrong, too. He just went even deeper than that. He basically was saying these schools that we call Ivy League schools are some of the first colleges that the colonizers basically officially opened up, right? So I didn't even know that. Comment below if you knew that shit, because that means that these colleges have been around even before the Civil War. And in a span of 25 years, they went from having just 3 colleges to 9.
It's with the height of the slave trade. It's precisely the rise and the elaboration of the...
My nigga, it's 2021. My man, Dr. Umar Johnson, he still haven't opened up his school, right? I think he's been trying to do that shit for the last 8-9 years now. It's interesting that my man Umar Johnson still can't open up his school, but in the span of 25 years, colonizers in the 1700s opened up 6 fucking Ivy League colleges in a span of 25 years. Now, I'm not limiting this, man. That sounds stupid to some people. Many people will build schools. Many people do. The only reason I'm saying that is because of the fact that I want to give y'all a metric for how you can weigh this shit out. You're telling me that in today's time, where we have more technology, more resources, and more understanding of how nature works, that it's harder to build a school than it is back then? That's basically the metric.
The Atlantic economy, based on the African slave trade, that allows for this sort of fantastic articulation of a new growth of the institutional infrastructure of the colony.
So let's talk specifically about particular universities. I mean, you do look at some universities in the South, but also in the deep North.
Yeah.
Harvard.
It's a very northern story, actually. When you think about the colonial world, until the American Revolution, there's actually only one college in the South, William and Mary. There are a couple of other attempts, but they fail. The other 8 colleges are all northern schools, and they're actually located.
I want y'all to understand this too. Not to say that the northern Native Americans weren't shit. That was very strong and very powerful too. But I guarantee you, if you go back and look at the history of what they're talking about, saying that then a lot of the Ivy League schools or the colonizer schools, when the Europeans first came to what they call America, more in the north. And you just said that, and I know for a fact that's because the stronghold of Native American presence and power was in the South at that time. So that's one of the ways where they try to flip it to make it seem like the Civil War was about this and that and that. When in reality, we already know now, thanks to so many great researchers, that the South was home to a lot of still strong powerhouses for Native American tribes, right? So if you try to build a college there, you liable, you telling me you got a house, you got a whole building full of these motherfucking Europeans that we want to destroy? You think we ain't gonna do that shit? Yes, we was fucking destroying they trying to build colleges and shit. I bet the Native Americans down in the South was like, oh, y'all want to build a college here? All right, either do a ritual to send a hurricane through that motherfucker, burn that bitch down. That's all they was doing. That's all they was thinking.
In key sites for the most part of the merchant economy, and where the slave traders had sort of come to power and rose as the sort of financial and intellectual backers, as the sort of financial and of the other 8 colleges are all northern schools. And they're actually located in key sites for the most part of the merchant economy, and where the slave traders had sort of come to power and rose as the sort of financial and intellectual backers of the new culture of the colonies.
So talk about Harvard.
Sure. Harvard, actually, from its very beginnings in 1636, the college by 1638 actually has an enslaved man living on campus who's referred to as the Moor. The Moor. And that actually is directly related to 2 slave trades. I imagine is how he gets to Cambridge. One is right after the Pequot War, the war in which the Puritans defeat the Indians of southern Connecticut. There's a Pequot slave trade into the West Indies. The captive Pequot are actually sold into the West Indies. That ship actually returns with enslaved Africans. And it's right after that moment that the Moor appears on campus and becomes part of the sort of legend of early Harvard.
Toward the end of the book, you include a photograph that shows 5 men who served as president of Harvard University from 1829 to...
I want y'all to see these people. Y'all not gonna be able to, wait, I might be able to, I still don't know how to turn the camera around on fucking Bigo, but I want y'all to see these people. Look at these people. Look at the costumes they wearing. You feel me? Okay, I showed Bigo. Now I gotta show Twitch. Hold on. Okay, Twitch. Can you see that? Can y'all see that? Look at the shit these people got on. Now, some people might be confused. Why is he showing their clothing, right? Because that is one of the main signifiers. Okay, we're talking about Harvard University presidents, right? Presidents. So the way these people are dressed is interesting, because as you go back and you look and throughout time and shit, these group of people were the first people to start dressing like this. This is presidential. This is a political dress code right here. We can now draw a line with these just by the way they're dressed to secret societies and shit like that. So Harvard University presidents, and these are Harvard University presidents from the year 1829 all the way to the year 1862. Interesting, right?
To 1862. Talk about their significance and relation to slavery.
What I wanted to show in that final chapter, that final epilogue, was the ways in which slavery, even after the end of slavery in the Northeast, even after the northern colonies and northern states had actually moved toward emancipation and finished their emancipation processes, they continued to have economic ties to the South and the West Indies. And so one of the ways you can trace that is just by looking at who became the president of these universities, who the presidents were. And the presidents were virtually always the sons or the sons-in-law of merchant traders, people who were West India suppliers. And so after the slave trade ends and after slavery ends in the northern states, one of the businesses that continues is supplying the South and the West Indies with everything, all the provisions that they needed to run the plantations.
So I want to look at this picture again. You've got...
So y'all gotta understand what the fuck is going on, bro. He just said this. He basically just said y'all gotta understand and relate stuff that happens back then to now too. So what he just said basically is that all the stuff that's happening today with Cuba, Haiti, and all those countries in the Caribbean islands, what they used to call, or what they call the West Indies, you know what I mean? All the problems that's going on politically today, that is all even going back to then. Listen to what he just said about how even though the South, quote unquote, wanted to get rid of it, even though the North, which was predominantly where all of these Ivy League schools were at this time, they wanted to stop relying on the South for their economy. They wanted to stop letting these, quote unquote, Native Americans, they wanted to stop relying on these Native Americans for their fucking resources. So they started a civil war, basically. But in between the times of them starting the Civil War, these fucking presidents of all of the Ivy League schools just so happen to be the people who were working on the slave trade. The very thing that the North supposedly was fighting the Civil War to stop. Interesting, right? And they're telling you that the whole time, the reason why they was fighting with the South, what they call the southern states, is because they didn't have a stronghold in the South. They didn't have a stronghold in the South the way they had a stronghold in the North. So what they really mean is, when they say southern states, they basically mean we trying to kill off these leftover fucking Native American tribes who got a stronghold on the eastern coast before we go over here to the west and keep fucking murdering. That's basically what's going on. And the organizer of all this stuff is the people who are harboring the information, keeping all the secrets for when they kill off a tribe, they collect all their values, as many as they can. Before they kill them off, they extort information out of them. They keep the information to themselves, and then they start their colleges, and then they start new courses, and then they become quote unquote professors to their people.
Quincy, you've got Everett, you've got, what is it, Sparks?
Yep, Sparks.
Mather.
Jared Sparks.
And Felton. Explain, for example, Mather. In fact, at Harvard University, there is a house named after
Mather. The Mathers actually go back a long way. And so, and they actually are part of the colonial story of slavery, too. Increase Mather of the second generation is actually a president of Harvard. And he uses his slave, which was a person given to him by his parish. He uses his slave to actually run the business of the college in the colonial period. The slave runs errands between the various trustees, and he writes in his diary that he sent his Negro to do various bits of work for the college. And if you think about, Edward Everett, Jared Sparks, one of the ways that that they had managed to achieve the kind of influence that they did, Sparks, for instance, becomes rather famous actually for his writings about early American history. He becomes something of a really quite polished American historian, but that was actually a way of also creating ties with the South, intellectual relationships with the South. And so his writings as a historian also allowed him to create intellectual connections to these very important regions, and regions that remained important in the financing of higher education long after slavery ends in the Northeast.
What about Yale University?
Yale actually is a very similar story. In 1701, when the original founders are actually meeting to establish what was then the collegiate school, they, as one of their chroniclers puts it, they come from the various towns to meet up, and they're followed by their men servants or their slaves. The enslaved people are actually at the founding of the institution. And once it's established, like most of...
See, You hear the stuff he's saying, and I don't know if he in on it or not. I'm guessing he's not because he's exposing the shit either way. Appreciate you, brother. But we gotta decipher this because he's saying it in a way where it's like, you know, kind of iffy. But what I'm saying is this: he's saying that the slaves were present during the founding, like they were basically in there. And in my opinion, if you ask me, like I was saying, they was getting information from them before they before they jugged them at the end of the day. They was jugging, bro. Like, how else do you want to see it?
Of the 18th century colleges, and especially by the 18th century as the slave trade peaks, the new business of higher education, the financial model for a successful college, requires, in fact, tapping into these new sources of wealth in the Americas. And that means the slave trade and the plantations of the South and the West Indies.
Did anyone at these universities, and I think you talk about it, Yale, say no to slaves?
Yes. Yes. You know, there's at every moment that there's a push towards slavery, there's also anti-slavery. There's an anti-slavery tradition actually emerging from the 17th century right through the 18th century. And much of it, because it's an intellectual movement, because it's a moral and religious movement, is actually housed on campus. And so you have this tension on campus, and I try and actually point that out at various times in the book. One of the examples that I use actually relates to the image that you showed of the presidents, and particularly Quincy. Under Quincy's administration, Charles Follen, the German the German professor at Harvard, who was a rebel in Germany and who was chased out for his radicalism, comes to the United States, gets appointed professor of German at Harvard, and then is immediately attracted to the abolitionist movement. Follen is actually punished for that decision. He eventually loses his professorship, and when you trace the origins of the professorship, the funding had largely come from families with ties to the slave trade and slavery.
I mean, that's very interesting. What you point out at places like Harvard is that a lot of the endowments for the professor chairs come from the slave trade.
Yeah, the very first endowed professorship at Yale, the Livingston Professor of Divinity, actually comes from the Livingston family of New York and New Jersey, and it's the second generation. Philip Livingston gives it in basically recognition of the fine education that his sons had received at Yale. And Livingston is one of the Livingstons are one of the larger slave trading families out of New York City, the rivals for places like Newport, Rhode Island, and Providence, which dominates the North American trade. Certainly the Philadelphians and the New Yorkers were trying to catch up.
We're going to talk about the DeWolf family, the largest slave trading family, in a moment. We're going to be joined by one of the DeWolfs, Katrina Brown, and how she traced the trade in her family. But I want to ask you about Princeton University.
Sure. Princeton is, to me, one of the more interesting of the schools. They're all distinct in some ways, but founded in 1746 and founded in a religiously radical tradition, evangelical tradition, Princeton finds itself struggling in its early years. In 1768, it had just had a sequence of short presidencies, 2 deaths, including 2 deaths of the president. And they recruit the Scottish minister, John Witherspoon. One of the Princeton alumni, then the College of New Jersey, is actually studying medicine in Edinburgh. And he's acting on behalf of his college to recruit John Witherspoon of Paisley to come to New Jersey. Witherspoon eventually makes the decision, he and his wife Elizabeth, to cross the Atlantic and go to New Jersey. And one of the things I argue in the book is that what would make this successful minister from Scotland attracted to a relatively unsuccessful college in a colony that's actually not, in fact, a powerhouse in North America? And the answer is really the extraordinary Scottish network in the Americas, the ways in which the Witherspoon family, in particular, had reached out across the Americas and branched out across the Americas and provided Witherspoon a way of actually securing and stabilizing the College of New Jersey by exploiting these family and national connections, the Scottish diaspora in the Americas. And it included particularly Scots who were moving into the Carolinas and Virginia, into the backcountry of Virginia and the Carolinas, and into the Caribbean.
And what did that have to do with slavery?
That means that actually what he ends up doing is sort of pointing and looking south for new sources of students and money. As soon as he arrives, in fact, shortly after he arrives, he publishes a missive to the West Indies in which he promises the planters of the British West Indies that their sons would be better off in Princeton, New Jersey, which is intimate and close enough where the faculty take very good care of the boys, rather than sending them to England, where young men from the West Indies are known to be wealthy and get preyed upon by people of loose morals and broad ambitions. So sending them to Princeton actually would be better for them, but it would also be better for Princeton. And he makes this, he's not the only one to do this. I should point out that if you look at those colleges that are founded in the mid-18th century, they all send ambassadors to the West Indies in search of money and students.
Tell us about Betsy Stockton, who was enslaved by an early 19th century president.
So, bruh, that's a lot to take in, but what I'm basically, all I'm thinking about this whole time, I know we just heard all that, but all I'm thinking about this whole time basically is the whole time that, you know, they were forcing Native Americans out of the South. You feel me? Even like continuously, basically, after they signed treaties and all this stuff, and they went back on the treaties and all this stuff. You can't tell me that most of the Native American tribes are out west. You feel me? And that's because they pushed most of them out west. But in reality, it's not supposed to be like that, because they signed treaties before that, and they went back on the treaties with this American law shit. You feel me? So after the Native Americans left, it was a bunch of, I don't want to disrespect nobody, but there was a bunch of, you know, what I'm hearing from him say is basically there was a bunch of naive, like young, stupid, fucking population of like British people and Europeans down south. And they basically up north, they wanted to get rid of the slavery shit so that it would shift the power into their control as merchants, sea merchants and stuff like that. So at the end of the day, they just basically playing chess with the South. And what they basically had in the South at that point was, like I said, it was a couple powerhouses left over in the South. Even after they told them to leave and shit, it was like, fuck that shit, I'm not leaving. You gotta force me to. And they couldn't force some of them to. So they ended up basically doing this shit with the war. And then they got a lot of the population of the leftover tribes to fight in the war. And yeah, they had the blacks, Native American tribes and the blacks of the South and the North fighting against each other and killing each other. And the same with Europeans and shit too, but not as much.
President of Princeton.
The Stockton is actually was given to the wife of that president as a gift when she was a younger woman, and then through marriage actually comes into the household of Ashbel Green, the president of Princeton, who ends up president of Princeton. He eventually emancipates her. He also actually establishes, and this is that tension between slavery and anti-slavery, he establishes a ministry with many of the people in the black community surrounding Princeton. He emancipates her. She lives in the president's house and continues to work there, and actually becomes quite famous as a biblical scholar. She becomes quite good at biblical geography. And
spending most of her time in his library.
And noted for her geographic skills, her biblical geographic skills. She then eventually becomes a school teacher in New York and heads off to a mission to the Sandwich Islands, to Hawaii, where her skill with language and religion become actually critical to the success of the mission. And so you have this person who is born enslaved and lives as an enslaved person on a college campus, and then who leads this extraordinary life afterwards.
You also talk about race science. You talk about the search for cadavers for scientific research at these universities.
Yeah. And one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to try and explain both how slavery and the slave trade provided the foundations for the rise of higher education in North America, But I also wanted to explain the role that colleges played in perpetuating slavery in the slave trade. And that's where you get to race science. That's where race science becomes critical, because it's precisely on campus that the ideas that come to defend slavery in the 19th century get refined. They get their intellectual legitimacy on campus. They get their scientific sort of veneer on campus. And they get their moral credentialing on campus. And so I wanted to trace that process. And one of the ugliest aspects of that is the use of marginalized people in the Americas, in the United
I told y'all, bro. I told y'all.
States. It's enslaved black people, often Native Americans, and sometimes the Irish, for experimentation. The bodies that were accessible as science rose, and science is rising in the 18th century.
Bruh, on my soul, bruh. I haven't seen this video ever. So,
in part by turning dissection and anatomy into the new medical arts. But that requires bodies, it requires people. In the British Islands, that means you're often exploiting Ireland. In North America, it means you're often taking advantage of people who have no legal and moral protection upon their bodies, the enslaved.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Actually, at Dartmouth, the medical college, it would be unfair to say that the medical college begins with this moment, but the teaching of science in Hanover begins when the physician to the president, the founder of Dartmouth, Eleazar Wheelock, drags the body of an enslaved black man who's deceased, named Cato, to the back of his house and boils that body in an enormous pot to free up the skeleton, to wire it up for instruction. That act is not unusual. In fact, when the first medical colleges are established in North America in the 1760s, the first is at the College of Philadelphia, which is now the University of Pennsylvania, and the second is at King's College, which is now Columbia. When those institutions are founded, actually, they're founded in part of what allows them to be established is access to corpses, access to people to experiment upon. And in fact, it's precisely the enslaved, the unfree, and the marginalized who get forcibly volunteered for that role.
Craig.
That's something that a lot of people don't like to talk about either, how sick a lot of these people we call researchers and shit like that are. A lot of the stuff that we know as people, especially the questions that we have about the microscopic world, the atomic world, it goes to that because there are subtle differences in groups of people and species and the whole diaspora of an environment. So how in the world do you tell me that it leads to the microscopic world, but then somehow we're still up here talking about black and white and shit like that? You get what I'm saying? So that's where they had a click you like, oh shit, we could take advantage of these people while they still thinking about stuff like that. We can still use their energy, keep that same system going, but just switch it up a little bit, make slavery less about like land. Make slavery less about like, okay, you tend the land and you get this and that, and make it more about like, politics, political shit, and basically using it as an arena to maintain power and you be able to play any card that you want to, because every part of the country has a different energy. And as long as you can trigger these energies at the time where either a foreign or another domestic attack is coming, you always gonna win. So while they're right here splitting open dead bodies of people who were quote unquote slaves, and you wonder why they didn't have no sympathy and shit like that, because they already in their mind it's justified because God wanted them to do that so that they can figure out what's really going on inside of a human body. That's their mind state of it. The mind state that they're doing, the mind state that they're going with. This was divinely given, the right given to me by God for me to be in a position to figure out the truth about the universe by slicing open somebody who would never even be able to understand this type of stuff that quote unquote I can understand. This is the mind state that these people have, and this is why they did that shit, and this is why we're at where we're at today, because the experiments that they doing on people. I just did a reaction video last week about that. Like the experiments they be doing on people, man. That video that I went into didn't even go into stuff like this, and that's the whole point. They not gonna really tell on themselves like that. You got to get a brother like this to even go like, oh yeah, these experiment, the knowledge that y'all have is in so many ways contributed to y'all taking advantage of regular everyday people who don't want to have no beef with you, not because they scared, but because they don't even fucking know your ass exists 9 times out of 10 until you send an agent of chaos.
Stephen Wilder, I want to ask you to stay with us. So we're going to trace one family's roots to the largest slaveholding family in America. And I'd like you to comment on it and how it links to the universities of this country.
All right. That's one video. Y'all already know how it goes. So I don't know if I'm gonna probably make this a reaction and a fucking goddamn podcast, because I might just chop it up and making some reaction videos and podcast at the same time.
Go to the gas station.
Right here. Besides the stupid advertisement, that I showed that Ivy League college thing because I always like to relate everything back to the present day that's happening in history, so that you can understand, you know, ain't nothing new under the sun for one. And I know you heard that from somebody in your fucking family or somebody in your fucking circle. Ain't nothing new under the sun. And but the second reason is also because when you look back at history and you understand that what we call history is really reality. It is why the world it is why the world is how it is today. What we define as the universe, our perception of it. It's all based off of what happened in the what we call past, the energy and the momentum that led to this moment, right? So when you understand that, then you can understand that these Ivy League, the reason I showed you the Ivy League video shit, Ivy League schools and how they're jugs and how they got all their knowledge in the first place. It's not because they just read books. Oh yeah, they want you to think, oh yeah, all these times they just got scribes and scrolls and ancient tech. They got ancient text and stuff like that they deciphering. And the reality is just a group of people that always in a society are willing to go to any extent possible to have knowledge, which also 9 times out of 10, if you take the knowledge and you confine it within yourself and you basically decide to share it with somebody else, it's up to you to decide how you're sharing that knowledge with somebody else, how you're sharing an experience with somebody else. So with that being said, since we already know these people have harbored all of the information over time and it's not based off of just old scribes and old texts and all these parables and the philosophy, and they want you to get lost in stuff like that. It's really based off of the human desire to know beyond the money, which was the money that we use, the Federal Reserve note, was created in 1913. We talking about some shit that happened before 1913 with the video we just saw. So the money is not really, it's not all about the money. It seems to have a lot to do with just wanting to know and being in the position to be so close to even understand. Over time, you keep doing experiments. But in order for you to understand how a new land works, how people on this land work, how the fruit and seeds and trees on this land works, you have to slice it. But before you slice it, you gotta poke it, you gotta feel it, you gotta test it out. Then you slice it, then you see how it's built in the inside. Then you take what you found, the different pieces on the inside, and then you slice those. Then you keep slicing. But in order for you to do this, it's all based off of the energy of the land. If you're foreign here, you have to keep doing that because the land always changes, of course. So you have to continuously keep going around and doing these experiments. And once you actually get a hold to how things can understand, once you actually get a hold of a new subject, then nature, if you're trying to control it, it's gonna find out new way, something new that you're gonna try to cut, that you're gonna have to cut. But somehow, some way, it's always gonna find a way to get around that
shit. Pay with Credit Karma money. Fill up your tank.
Which brings us
do with academic. Academic standard.
Cornell.
So Cornell West.
I seen this video the other day, or I seen this video passing my timeline the other day. I unsubscribed to Kyle Kalinske. Callie. KK. I unsubscribed to him, but they still, you know how the algorithm works. So I seen this video. It says Cornell was betrayed by Harvard. I haven't watched it yet. And he said resigns. And I thought he already resigned, honestly. And I'm not really too deep on Cornell West information and shit like that, honestly. But I know he's a professor. I know he was I think he was a part of some black organization or something like that. NAACP or something like that. With that being said, he resigned from Harvard, right? And I think that's in New York or so up north. I'm not sure. I'm not even going to make a butt of myself, but I think it's up north somewhere. I know that for sure in America, and we're gonna figure out what this fuck. And this is coming from the school that we already know we just got the history on, right? So we're gonna check out what the fuck they got to say and what the fuck they got going on in the present day. Since we think that the world is so peaceful and everything is so organized and legal and everything is justified and moralized, and justice is actually justice. There's no more murdering. There's no more sucking the vampiring off of what they call colored people or minorities. There's no more of that. And white people, certain European groups are minorities too in these people's mind. You have to understand that. It's not no, oh yeah, everybody come together type shit. No. And even those groups are exclusive to themselves. They don't fuck with other. They most likely don't fuck with other groups themselves. Until it's once again certain times where they have to take advantage of certain people, and I think that's what's going on today with Cornell West. You know what I'm saying? They suck the energy off of these people. They're hard. They know the character of people. They hardworking. They committed to their work. You feel me? They want to bring they're powerhouses basically. You get what I'm saying? And in these universities and stuff like that, you take advantage, you drain the energy of that, and then in today's time, it's just like the same thing how they were saying back in the day. Like they had quote unquote slaves, okay, They had slaves working at these Ivy League schools, working close in the corridors, working with the presidents and shit like that. And we're gonna see what's going on.
West has officially resigned from Harvard, and you know, the breakup has been a little bit ugly. They treated him very unfairly and unkind. He was on Crystal Kyle and Friends a while ago, and he's such a lovely guy. He's a beautiful person. Off air, he's just as amazing as he is on air, and he was so, you know, thankful at the fact that we had like a real substantive conversation with him. Just an amazing person, just kindest soul you can imagine. So I want to read you his resignation letter here, and then we'll talk about it. So he released this publicly, June 30th, 2021. I hope and pray, he just released this the other day, but it was sent to Harvard on June 30th, 2021. I hope and pray you and your family are well. This summer is a scorcher. Here's my brief and candid letter of resignation. How sad is it to see our beloved Harvard Divinity School in such decline and decay? The disarray of a scattered curriculum, the disenchantment of talented yet deferential faculty, and the disorientation of precious students loom large. When I arrived 4 years ago with a salary less than what I received 15 years earlier, and with no tenure status after being a university professor at Harvard and Princeton, I hoped and prayed I could still end my career with some semblance of intellectual intensity and personal respect. How wrong I was. With a few glorious and glaring exceptions, the shadow of Jim Crow was cast in its new glittering form expressed in the language of superficial diversity. All my courses were subsumed under Afro-American religious studies, including those on existentialism, American democracy, and the conduct of life. No possible summer salary alongside the lowest increase possible every year. Yet I delivered 2 convocation addresses and 1 commencement speech in 4 years. I was promised a year sabbatical, but could only take 1 semester in practice. And to witness a faculty enthusiastically support a candidate for tenure, then timidly defer to a rejection based on the Harvard administration's hostility to the Palestinian cause was disgusting. We all knew the mendacious reasons given had nothing to do with academic standards. When my committee recommended a tenure review, also rejected by the Harvard administration, I knew my academic achievements in student teaching meant far less than their political prejudices. Even my good friends in the Afro-American and African Studies Department were paralyzed, given their close relationship to the administration. And after teaching extra courses, including
Those relationships to the administration. You know what I'm saying? To this day, they're doing the same stuff.
5 courses in 1 year, this silence continued. When the announcement of the death of my beloved mother appeared in the regular newsletter, I received 2 public replies, just as that of my colleague, Dr. Jacqueline Olga Cook-Rivers, who received none when her beloved mother died. Any ordinary announcement about a lecture, award, or professional advancement receives about 20 replies. The kind of narcissistic academic professionalism, cowardly deference to the anti-Palestinian prejudices of the Harvard administration, and indifference to my mother's death constitute an intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy of deep depths. In my case, a serious commitment to veritas requires resignation. With precious memories but absolutely no regrets, Cornel West. Wow. So let me highlight the key portions for you and sum it up. He wasn't given tenure, even though he should have been given tenure. He was paid worse than he was 15 years ago. All of his courses were under Afro-American religious studies, even though a lot of those courses had nothing to do with Afro-American religious studies. So existentialism he taught about, American democracy, the conduct of life, all of that somehow was under Afro-American studies. It's almost like they typecast him and just put him in that position. Even despite being mistreated, he did 3 big speeches, which is, you know, he's also doing a little bit of a favor for the institution, even though the institution's stabbing him in the back. He was denied a full sabbatical, even though he was promised one. He still went on to teach extra courses, thinking, hey, maybe this will get me my tenure or more my full sabbatical or whatever. It didn't. And he was, for all that he did for Harvard, he was rewarded with virtual silence when his mother died. And he viewed that as basically the last straw. And so he left. And listen, he says the main thing he feels that took us down this path was that He was a staunch advocate for Palestinian rights, staunch advocate for it, and he was institutionally crushed as a result of it. We've talked about it before, but one of the key...
Now we deciphering who's pulling the strings in this situation. If he's being fired because he's a strong advocate for Palestinian rights, then we already know it's Israel. We already know it's what they call the Zionist.
Issues on the forefront of the free speech fight. It's Palestinian rights and Palestinian justice. We have states all across this country that have tried to crack down on BDS, boycotts, divestment, and sanctions, even to the point where in Texas, in order for you to receive relief money from a hurricane, you needed to say, I'll never sign on to boycott, divestment, and sanctions of Israel. So we have speech restricting the criticism of Israel in this country. You're allowed to criticize the United States of America, but in many instances, you're not allowed to criticize Israel. An insane crackdown on freedom of speech. Insane crackdown. And those anti-BDS laws have popped up all across the country. You know, there's been, when you talk about academic freedom, there's been a number of professors who have, you know, had retribution taken against them because they speak out for Palestinian rights. So this is a very high-profile example of that, and it's unacceptable. As I said, from a personal perspective, he's one of the most lovely people I've ever dealt with in my life. He's full of love and acceptance and joy. And he loves life. And to have this, one of the top living intellectuals of our time, be disrespected and besmirched like this is unacceptable. It's totally unacceptable. And this should help people understand and realize. When we talk about free speech, it's always going to be the left that's on the chopping block, because a true commitment to left values is a true commitment to anti-establishment politics. And if you're questioning the establishment, if you're questioning the powers that be and the status quo, they don't take kindly to that. And they definitionally have the power. And so they'll come after you. So everybody be careful what you wish for if you cheer on censorship and deplatforming, because any crackdown on free speech or academic freedom or free expression does not end well. And this is a great example of it right here. I feel really bad for Cornell West. I'm sure some other university will pick them up, and they'll definitely be lucky to have them, but this does not speak well of Harvard. Not at all.
So, once again, we see the cycle continues. They're draining the energy of people who are intellects of this land, people who are beautiful people of this land. Not just men, women also. Beautiful, intelligent, strong people. They're draining their energy. And when they drain your energy, they only want you for a specific thing. And because they're it's robotic. It's a robotic system because they're lazy with it. They want it to be perpetual. They want it to be an automated system. And if you're not a part of the automation, if you ain't part of the goddamn robot, if you don't want your whole body ain't gonna make it, but we'll use your leg. We'll use your right leg. You can live on through your right leg. Give us your leg. My guy Cornell, he said no. You know what I mean? So that's what's up. And the result of that is more people getting exposed more and more. The system is getting exposed more and more. We're seeing the agenda is obviously geared towards making a civil war or some type of class war pop off in the United States, so that they can start a new type of government here, and then they still gonna continue their global domination because the United States is not what they it used to be because we're not going for the bullshit no more. But at the same time, why would why would I only be in control of the United States and be a powerhouse in the United States when I control the world? And they've been on that mind state. That's why if you look at the map and you tell me, you feel me, somehow they want you to believe that the majority in all these countries and these land masses that they went to and invaded over time, when they so far away in some circumstances, in the circumstance of like Australia and like different shit like that, in Hawaii and even in the United States, you're under the illusion that Europeans are the majority in places like this. So, with that being said, you don't know about the original cultures there. You don't know about the history of none of that shit. None of it. But now you do. You've been equipped with some new knowledge. This is be CGT Reacts.